thank you to the delegates for joining us today. So today we will look at modern slavery risks and the mistakes SMEs in global value chains make that expose them to these risks. Modern slavery, let me just double check here if my screen is sharing, my apologies. There we go. So today we will look at modern slavery risks and the mistakes SMEs in global value chains make that expose them to these risks. So modern slavery is an umbrella term which includes human trafficking, slavery and slave-like practices, servitude, forced labor, debt bondage, worst forms of child labor, and deceptive recruiting for labor or services. Although slavery has been abolished over 100 years ago, it is a corrupt practice that is sadly still thriving today, and it is the fastest growing illegal crime in the world, with it being estimated that there are more slaves today than in any other time in history. According to the International Labour Organization, modern slavery generates $150 billion in annual profit. That is why it is so important for companies to consider and to incorporate anti-modern slavery compliance practices within their operations, as it forms part of responsible business practices and protects not only the business, but also the rights and well-being of its employees. Over the past few years, there has been an international shift in terms of anti-modern slavery practices, with countries such as California, UK, and Australia implementing legislation that places a direct obligation on companies to comply, with other countries not far behind in implementing similar legislation. In terms of their legislation, companies are required to ensure anti-modern slavery compliance practices within their direct operations, whilst conducting due diligence on their supply chains to prevent and mitigate these risks in their supply chains. Further to this, they are also required to publish annual reports on the anti-modern slavery efforts that are publicly available. But are we untouched by modern slavery? Let's have a look at the next two questions. So please, on the right-hand side of your screen, go to the polls and then to the bottom two questions that are showing on the polls. Then you can answer the two, have you had your morning coffee yet? And then the next one, do you own any electronic devices that rely on battery power or rechargeable batteries? So we will give about 30 seconds for you to answer those questions, please. Then when you have answered them, you can press submit your vote. Okay, I'm going to give about 10 more seconds. Okay, fantastic. So who has had their morning coffee yet? I definitely have. I need my coffee daily, especially in the morning. So the use of forced labor, child labor, and forced child labor on coffee bean farms are often seen across the world. Since the agriculture sector is a high-risk sector in terms of modern slavery, suppliers often buy the coffee beans from the farmer for below market value, which has the knock-on effect that employment conditions on the farm are not always in line with legislative requirements. And then with the second question of, do you own any electronic devices that rely on battery power or rechargeable batteries? Just off the top of my head, I've got a cell phone and I'm currently working off of my laptop that also uses a battery. So cobalt is a key component used in batteries and rechargeable devices. In order to source this element, mining operations are required. Sadly, the use of child labor is a common occurrence in this sector. So from the above two instances, we can see how modern slavery affects our personal day-to-day lives in terms of the products that we buy and use, and it also shows the vital role that companies play, not only within the supply chain, but also within the value chain. It all comes down to cost and worth. The actual cost of a product or service in terms of modern slavery cannot be compared to the worth of a responsibly sourced or produced product or service. At this point in time, you might be thinking that no one in your company might be a victim of modern slavery. But is it really this clear-cut? Or are there gray areas that may potentially lead to increased risks of modern slavery? So as we can see on this scale, modern slavery happens at the most extreme end of the spectrum that ranges from decent work to serious criminal exploitation. In decent work environments, employee rights are respected and they are free to refuse or stop working. Employees are paid fairly and are at least paid minimum wage with a safe workplace environment. At the other end of the spectrum lies modern slavery, where employees cannot refuse or stop work because of the use of force, threats or perceived threats of harm, intimidation or coercion, or physical restraint to that person or another person. In the middle is where we find the gray area, which can increase a company's potential risks of modern slavery, as it is a short, slippery slope from here to modern slavery if it is not rectified. Here it is important to keep in mind that it is not only necessary to assess these potential risks within your direct operations, but also within your supply chain and labor supply chain. I have worked with numerous companies, and some of the common mistakes that we have picked up are the following. HR policies. Quite often, the necessary HR policies aren't in place. In those instances, we find that the lines become blurred. This is crucial as the policies and procedures provide a guideline in terms of the applicable legislation to the company. Recruitment practices. Recruitment practices might not be regulated, and the process is sometimes questionable. Whether a company recruits directly or outsources recruitment to a third party, such as a recruiter or a labor broker, this is an important potential factor to consider due to the risk of employees being charged recruitment fees or being recruited under false pretenses. Employment contracts. Inconsistent provision or lack of employment contracts is problematic. My apologies. Every employee should be provided with an employment contract in a language that is understood by the employee before employment commences. The scope of work for which the employee has been recruited should be the same as the scope of employment contained in the employment contract and the actual scope of employment of such employee. In terms of overtime, we have worked with companies where their employees work excessive hours, with these hours being disguised as normal working hours with no provision being made for overtime. So overtime cannot be disguised as regular working hours. Any overtime worked by an employee should be remunerated according to the country's applicable labor laws. No employee may be forced to work any amount of overtime against their will through the use of threats or perceived threats of harm, intimidation, or coercion. Salaries, deductions, and pay slips. All salaries or wages must be in line with the country's local laws in terms of minimum wage payments. Each employee must be provided with a payslip for each salary or wage payment period that sets out the salary and any deductions made. No deductions may be made from an employee's salary without such employee's previous consent thereto or in terms of legislative requirements. Deception in salary payment or salary advances and loans to employees may not be used to bind employees to employment. Employees may not be held in debt bondage or forced to work for an employer in order to pay off either an actual or a perceived debt. And then lastly, freedom of movement. Under no circumstances may coercion be used to physically confine or imprison employees either to the workplace, any provided accommodation, or any other related premises. Employees should at all times have the right to freedom of movement. The next question begs to be asked. So how do we go from here? The process flow can easily be summarized in the following 4 steps. Identify, assess, prevent, and mitigate. These steps can be used within the company itself as well as within its suppliers. So the first one, to identify. Every company has potential risks when it comes to modern slavery. That is why it is important to identify these risks, whether it is operating within a high-risk country or sector or employing low-skilled employees, which increases their vulnerability factors. None of these are bad things to do, but we need to be aware of all of these risk factors in terms of modern slavery. The second one is assess. After identifying all the potential risks within your operations, as well as those within your supply chain, each risk needs to be assessed to ascertain its risk level. Some risks might be lower and others might be a higher risk. Assessing the risk helps to guide us in our approach going forward. Thirdly is prevent. After the risks have been critically assessed, we need to consider which risks we can prevent as far as is reasonably practicable. And then the last one, mitigate. In the event that certain risks cannot be prevented, then steps must be taken to mitigate the risks as far as is reasonably practicable. To put this into a practical example, you will start with mapping your supply chain so that you are aware of the first and second tier suppliers, who they are, and where exactly the product originates from. From there, you will conduct due diligence on each supplier to identify potential risks within their operations, which may ultimately become potential risks within your operations. So, for instance, employees who in your supplier's operations, are employees free to leave employment? Are they paid for their services, and do they have employment contracts in place? Each of these risks needs to be assessed to ascertain its risk level. Then we move on to prevent and mitigate. So there we will put down each step to prevent the risks or to mitigate these risks. So all of this, or this entire process, is then contained within a written anti-modern slavery policy within the business. And this then provides the guidelines going forward. So depending on the potential risks that have been identified after conducting due diligence on either your suppliers or doing a risk assessment within your operations. So it can be as simple as providing information sessions to your suppliers on what modern slavery is, and then having them sign service level agreements where they commit to responsible business practices, and then conducting audits on their businesses. So being anti-modern slavery cannot be accomplished within our own little bubble. It takes a village, and in this case, it's not to raise a child. But it requires companies to create a culture shift, to be transparent, and to work together on these issues in order to achieve a successfully responsible supply chain. So if anyone would like to get in contact with me, you are welcome to send me an email or to give me a call. But we do still have a couple of minutes left on our session. So let's open up for any questions which you might have. Okay, so I am looking here through the Q&A board. I see Dylan James asked, who and how do you report such practices? So if either with your with one of your suppliers, or if it is within your own business operations, if it does have the criminal element to it, in South Africa, you can report it to your local SAPS branch, or you can report it to the South African Human Trafficking Resource Hotline, that you can contact them on 0800 222 777. Let me have a look here for another question. Okay, I see Olive has a question here. For one, the organizational culture sets tone of majority of these issues. Issue would be how to empower majority personnel to be aware of these. As much as we would want to cut costs in supply chain, it is hard to sift off suppliers who are actually underage, etc. Yes, it is definitely there is a cost factor involved with being anti-modern slavery compliant. So that's why it's crucial to work with your suppliers. So if there is a supplier who perhaps some of their practices, it might not have the criminal element involved with it, but it might point to possible exploitative practices within the workplace. Then start off with an educational session with them. Work with them. It is important that the price that you pay for the product should be able to ultimately make it possible for that supplier to pay minimum wages to their employees, provide a safe working environment to their employees. So it is working together as businesses to achieve that. Okay, I think that we are now out of time because I see that it is already 12 minutes to 12, and our session was only allowed time until 1:45. So please, if anyone has any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to me directly.